Andrej Karpathy, who we have talked about many times, ex-OpenAI, Tesla AI researcher, just gave an interview about the road to autonomous intelligence on the No Priors podcast. And in it, he covered a ton of ground in like 45 minutes. He's just brilliant and giving all these great takes on AI for self-driving cars, robotics, education, and much more. Interestingly, he also speculated we may see the development of kind of AI ecosystems in business where you essentially have like an AI organization that resembles a company where various models work together to achieve specialized roles that create business value. So definitely getting into like the future as now in this conversation. So Paul, you had flagged this and said you found it really notable and valuable. Like what jumped out at you here as particularly worth paying attention to?
This fits in that realm that Mike and I talk a lot about of, listen, when the leading AI researchers and entrepreneurs talk, listen. Like there's always pieces of information within these interviews where you learn something new, it validates something you already believe to be true.
Mm,
But if nothing else, you get a window into where these leading minds are and what they think is going to happen next. So again, as I've always said, anytime it's Sutskever or Ilya or Dario Amade or Demis Hassabis or Sam, like I'll listen every time because there's always something in that interview. So a couple of things I found interesting. For me personally, Tesla versus Waymo. He spent a lot of time on this. So if you don't recall, he ran AI at Tesla for 5 years. He was in
mm,
charge of building full self-driving at Tesla. So he knows ins and outs of that system probably better than anybody in the world. And if you've been in a Waymo or if you've been on the West Coast, you've maybe seen a Waymo driving around without a human driver. I was recently in Scottsdale, and that's like epicenter of Waymo right now. That and then out in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, these things are driving around everywhere. Well, the Waymos have these like huge contraptions, big piece of hardware on them that's enabling them to drive without a driver on these city roads. Tesla has gone the opposite direction. Tesla's computer vision only. It's got 8 cameras. Those cameras have the ability to see the roads, see objects, and that's how they learn and drive. Now, I have had a Tesla. I'm on my third one, so I've had it for 7 years, and I've been monitoring the full self-driving all the way along. If you've read our book, I actually have a whole
mm,
section of a chapter dedicated to how these models learn and why it matters. Um, but he said that he actually, while some people don't believe this to be true, he thinks Tesla is way ahead of Waymo, even though Waymo actually has cars driving people like taxi cabs, basically, or Ubers without drivers. Um, he feels Tesla is way ahead because he thinks Tesla only has to solve a software problem and that is a very tractable thing to solve.
mm.
He feels that Waymo, which still has these really expensive devices, LiDAR and radar and all these other cameras, um, that they have a massive hardware problem to solve, and that's a much harder thing to get to. So I thought he had a really interesting perspective, and then he shared something I hadn't heard before, which is Tesla does use LiDAR, and they use all these other things only in their training sets. So they have cars that have the LiDAR to go do all this mapping, but then the actual vehicle itself doesn't have those expensive systems. And so they're able to scale by focusing more on the training side and investing there, and then like diluting that or um, what's the term? Diluting, whatever. Dilation, they call it,
Mm.
taking it down to these like smaller models.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that was kind of cool. The other thing I thought was fascinating is transformers. So we know transformers are the basis for ChatGPT and large language models. Transformer invented by the Google Brain team in 2017 with the Attention is All You Need paper. He is very bullish on the transformer. So he talked about these things as being largely underappreciated for how well they have scaled over these 7 years and with very little change. And so while there's some in the AI research community that think transformers are going to kind of like run up against these data walls and have other issues, he seems extremely bullish on transformers and the potential to continue building on top of them.
Mm.
He talked a lot about data. And the one thing I thought was really interesting is on episode 113 last week, we talked about this idea that the internet, which is where a lot of the training data comes for these models, is full of outputs. And what the internet lacks is the reasoning process that humans go through to get to those outputs, and that is fundamental to building like smarter AI models that can do this like system two thinking. And so he talked exactly about that, about how like this internet data is lacking, but all the research labs are like working on solving that. That also led into memorization. I think this is a really important thing for people with the future of education and work. The reality is, like right now, these models have limited memory. So, what 2 million context window, I think, is with Google Gemini is still the industry leading right now. Their research has shown they can get it to 10 million or more
Yeah.
tokens, which is roughly 9.5 million words. Like it would remember everything basically perfectly in that environment. So, I think most AI research labs assume that we are heading toward a day of infinite memory for these models. That they will just remember everything, and they will have instant recall on this. And so it's very important when we think about like what do we teach? How do we teach? How do we develop skills for professionals in our organizations? You do this under the assumption that we are all going to have infinite memory on call, that these models are going to remember everything. And so memorization of topics, being able to regurgitate things you've learned, isn't a human advantage. So
Mm.
when we think about how we train students, how we develop people, forcing them to just remember stuff isn't going to be uniquely human at all. And so he talks a lot about how these transformers actually have some advantages over the human brain, that there are these limitations, these inefficiencies in the human brain, and how these transformers won't and don't have those inefficiencies. And that can be kind of important moving forward. Talk a little bit about smaller models. We've touched on this quite a bit, how these bigger models are going to train and oversee the smaller models, which actually led to what you were mentioning, this idea of like AI models or LLMs making up companies that your CEO is maybe like GPT-6. It's the big massive model that took 100 billion to train in a couple of years. That's your CEO. And then it manages a swarm of smaller models that are more cost efficient that do specific things. And that's something that I think is very abstract for people, but Andrej isn't alone in talking about this. I went back to for my opening keynote actually at MACON this week. I went back and pulled the excerpt from July 2023 Atlantic article called "Does Sam Altman Know What He's Creating?" And in that article, Ilya Sutskever talked about this exact concept. He said, "The way I think about the AI of the future is not as someone as smart as you or as smart as me, but as an automated organization,
Mm.
constituent AIs working together at a high speed like bees in a hive. A single AI organization would be as powerful as 50 Apples or Googles." So this idea of like these big models and small models working together, I think that's something we're going to be hearing a lot more about and could start to play into like, I mean, Andres is building Eureka Labs.
Yeah.
My guess is he's building in this version. Like what's going to happen is these leading AI researchers are going to start building their own companies this way, and that'll set the groundworks for, you know, where we go. And then the final thing, which is the thing I'd shared on LinkedIn, is I have tremendous respect for Andres. Like I think he teaches with a humility that I find inspiring. His intro to LLMs YouTube video from earlier this year is like this amazing view into where everything is going. And so when he announced he had left OpenAI earlier this year, when he announced he was doing education, I was like, why? Like, what is
Mm.
he could raise billions. I mean, Ilya just raised 1 billion last week. Like, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Like, Andrej could raise billions to build an AI company, and yet he's seems to be focusing on education. And so they asked him point blank, like, why? And I loved his answer. He said, I would start with, I've always been an educator. I love learning. I love teaching. And so it's a space that I've been very passionate about for a long time. One macro picture that's kind of driving me is there's a lot of activity in AI to replace or displace people. It's the theme of sliding away the people, but I'm always more interested in anything that empowers people. And I feel like I'm team human, and I'm interested in things that AI can do to empower people. I don't want the future where people are on the side of automation. I want people to be very in an empowered state, and I want them to be amazing, even more amazing than they are today. And so I love that approach. And my basic belief is we just need more high profile AI researchers, investors, entrepreneurs on Team Human, as we
Mm.
would say. and we'll have to see how it plays out. But I think people like Karpathy taking this position opens the door for a lot of other AI researchers to take a similar position of innovation over replacement, basically that augmentation of people versus replacing the people. So yeah, it's a great interview. It's very technical. It's heavy on robotics for the first like 25 minutes. So if you're not that interested in that, you can kind of skip ahead to the other stuff. But always, like I said, there's insights when you hear these people give talks.